Speaking of random Game of Thrones references, Valamogulis. Speaking of random Game of Thrones references, Fire and Blood. Speaking of random Game of Thrones references, Here We Stand. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Ours is the Fury. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, The North Remembers. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Jane Poole. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Hodor. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references... Can't even think of one now. Damn it. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, I am the god of tits and wine. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, The King in the North. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Chaos is a Ladder. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, I am the shield that guards the realms of men. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, As High as Honour. No one knows that one. No one cares about the Aryans. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Ath Jahakar. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, What is Dead May Never Die. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Winter is Coming. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, Fuck the King. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, I Think I'll Have Another Chicken. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, The Sword of the Morning. Speaking of random and unnecessary Game of Thrones references, The Bear and the Maiden Fair.